Hello, friends, and welcome to Impact Everywhere, a podcast that helps you find people having a positive impact in unexpected places. My name is Benjamin Von Wong, and today I'm excited to have John Hocevar here on the show with us today. John is a lifelong activist, scientist, explorer, and the director of Greenpeace's ocean campaigns all the way since 2004. Over the last 16 years, he's directed campaigns to help establish the largest marine reserve in the world, helped persuade the country of Japan to drop plans to hunt humpback whales, and has been hard at work setting the new standards for sustainable seafood, just to name a few. In today's episode, I decided to dive deep and ask John about the inner workings of a Greenpeace campaign, the intersectionality of environment and social justice issues, and how he stays optimistic as the oceans continue to die at an ever-accelerating rate. Because John is a true environmentalist and owns very little stuff, the microphone he had at home was a little bit subpar. The perfectionist in me wants to throw out the episode, but because the conversation was so interesting, I came up with an alternative strategy, and that is to simply restructure my podcast. This week, I'll be doing a lot of the talking and summarizing, while only keeping the best parts of John's interviews to make this a better listening experience for you guys. And with that said, let's get started. When I first started the interview, I wanted to ask John about Greenpeace's recent shift in communication style. I've been following Greenpeace closely on social media because they're an amazing indicator of where the public stands on environmental issues. They do a phenomenally good job of adapting their communications based on what people want to hear, and are also trying their best to balance between what the world needs and what corporations and governments are just barely willing to do. Over the last couple weeks, I'd noticed that Greenpeace made a substantial shift in messaging to get behind the Black Lives Matter movement and to put their considerable weight behind the battle for racial equality. And so with that very top of mind, I started off by asking John about the connection between human justice and sustainability.
I think there are still people that are wondering why Greenpeace is talking about racism, or when we talk about human rights and slavery on fishing boats, they're like, well, shouldn't you just focus on saving dolphins? These things are connected. We can pretend that they're not, but you really don't have to look too deeply to see that intersectionality isn't just a millennial trendy thing to say. You can't save the planet if you don't deal with the people that are a big part of what's going on this planet. We can't have a healthy ocean if we don't have justice. And there are a bunch of small and large scientific studies that pull apart pieces of that. But overall, it's not that complicated. If people are hungry, if people are angry, things are not going to work. Even if you manage to create laws that could work in theory, they're not going to work in practice. And if people are angry and hungry and getting shot, then no one's going to pay attention to you talking about fish either. Like, we have to deal with all of this stuff.
I loved hearing that. In the environmental circles, we often hear how poverty and inequality are the biggest enemies of the environment. Nobody is going to want to protect the environment if they can't put food on the table, and it's one of the reasons why I personally dislike the way corporations and sometimes startups like to put on their websites, "We focus on SDGs 12, 14, and 15. I always wonder, well, what about all the rest? It's all connected. You can't just focus on some pieces of the system and ignore the others. You need to find a way to elevate all of them at the same time. And that's why John was so excited about this particular moment in time. The last time John had seen anything close to what's going on today was a momentum that existed behind the ocean plastics movement. So much more could happen in so much less time than usual. And his hope is the same that can happen with what's going on in America today with Black Lives Matter.
One of the things that has been most interesting about this moment that we're in right now with the movement for Black Lives is the power of a particular moment. And in all of my time working full-time for social and environmental justice, I've never experienced a moment like this where you can accomplish so much so quickly. My take is that we should really be putting everything else aside and going all in support of that, seeing how much we're able to accomplish together. If we have an opportunity to have a worldwide conversation about racism, about policing, about violence, and then all of the social issues that are tied up in that, education and welfare and all these other things, let's do that. Let's see how far we can get.
In episode 3 of Impact Everywhere on the science of social movements with Will Mesner, we visited the importance of trigger events. These trigger events are small moments in time where popularity and awareness of a problem rise so sharply that things that felt previously impossible suddenly become possible. To not capitalize on it, to try and bring about positive social change, would be a totally lost opportunity. And while some might describe it as opportunistic, I personally feel like it's necessary. When I asked John about what lessons might be learned from the current movement that could be applied into the environmental context instead, this is what he had to say.
Some of these issues are scarier for people to talk about than others. Like racism is one where people are just uncomfortable. And that's part of what makes it so difficult. If you can't ask questions and you're afraid to say the wrong thing, then it's a lot harder to get to where you need to. As an individual, never mind to the point where you can say useful things to other people. Definitely still seeing people say stupid things and intentionally inflammatory things. But there's a lot of intention in terms of trying to learn, trying to understand things. And maybe there are lessons there for us on other less connected issues. How do we help people feel more comfortable asking questions? How do we share tools and information in a way that feels empowering instead of overwhelming?
In other words, we need to always find a way to be inclusive within our communications. Make it easy for people to learn and make mistakes. Make it even easier for them to share once they've learned something new. And give them an opportunity to be the hero once they've taken that first step. Genius. We talked about current events a little longer before I decided to take a step back and ask him about the structure of a Greenpeace campaign. What frameworks did they use? What were the building blocks in order to build a movement from nothing?
First, what are the biggest issues? Like, what are the most urgent threats? If it's not on that list, then we should probably not be talking about it. Or in some cases, it's an emerging threat. Like maybe it isn't there right now. Maybe it's something that we can kind of head off at the pass. Like we can kill it before it really gets started, like deep sea mining. So once we have that list, then we look around and say, okay, where is there a real need for more effort? Is this something that is basically going to be solved without us? Or can we make a real contribution? Who else is in the space? How long have they been working? What are the things that they bring? What are the gaps? So the kind of gap analysis. We have to ask, what are the solutions? Is this something that we can actually make a real world impact on? And then we start talking about specifically what our contribution can look like. A lot of times what Greenpeace does is shift the feeling of what is possible. We tend to focus on what the science says is necessary, not what feels possible right now in this moment. And we're much better at and more interested in changing the political climate than understanding it. We talk about how at the beginning of a Greenpeace campaign, what we're saying usually feels impossible. And by the end of it, it usually feels inevitable. We're constantly reassessing our plans as the world shifts around us. Like any organization, we have to create time-bound plans. We have to be able to make a compelling case for why people should support us. We have to show them why they should believe that we can actually accomplish the things that we're setting out to do. We will regularly set out to do something that we're not confident we'll be able to resolve in 10 years. Within that, we break it up into more manageable chunks. These are milestones along the way that we feel like we need to meet to show that we're on the right track. Like, is this strategy working or not? The idea of failing fast is hard, but it's important to us. We don't want to spend 5 years and fail. We need to be evaluating and testing along the way to make sure that we're moving in the right direction.
Hearing John speak almost made me feel like I was talking to Anya from episode 12 all over again. When you read between the lines, all of Greenpeace's decisions boil down to two recurrent questions. Are we being the most effective organization that we possibly can be? And what is our comparative advantage? Or in other words, what can we do that nobody else can do? Curious to hear more about his personal journey, I decided to throw John a different set of questions. I wanted to know why he had spent 14 years with Greenpeace and not bothered switching into another career path. Was it passion? Loyalty? Effectiveness? After all, the average marriage in the United States only lasts 8 years, and he's lasted 14.
I ask myself that sometimes. The reason that I stay is that I haven't found something else I could do yet where I feel like I can have more of an impact on things I care about. I've changed the way I work within my job to keep me from getting burned out and to make me feel like I am being effective and using my time in useful ways. But also, I really like where we set the bar, focusing on what's needed, not what seems possible right now. And then I like that we have a bit of a scary brand. Like I've worked at smaller organizations where you have to struggle to get people to call you back. Like you at least want to know what Greenpeace is concerned about. You may not want to do it right away, but at least you want to know what's going on. You don't want it to be a surprise because a Greenpeace surprise could be unpleasant. So I enjoy that.
The definition of effective, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is producing a decided, decisive, or desired effect. And breaking that down, it boils down to two components: a desire for change and the ability or power to bring about that change. And that's great for those who work in an effective organization already, but what about if you're just an individual like me? What would that look like if we boiled that same concept down to the individual level? My follow-up question to John was, what should we do as an individual if we're looking to unlock our most effective self?
It's funny, I have really conflicting thoughts on this one. I think of almost everything in terms of goals and strategies and tactics. So the clearer sense that you have of what you want to accomplish in the world, that can be really helpful in guiding all the decisions that you make. At the same time, that can mean that you miss some pretty important opportunities. And if I had taken that approach, I would probably not have this job. I went to grad school. I worked on marine biology. I had 3 months in between marine biology jobs and agreed to help get this organization called Students for a Free Tibet off the ground. And that had nothing to do with the ocean or anything that I didn't know anything about Tibet. I'd never met a Tibetan. But because I took that detour, which ended up being 10 years and not 3 months, I learned the skills and had the experiences and met the people that eventually it makes sense for Greenpeace to want to hire me. It was a pretty solid detour, but it was useful and helped me understand how these environmental issues and human rights issues and justice issues are connected.
With COVID still fairly top of mind and so many careers in limbo, hearing John talk about how sometimes straying away from your intended path can end up bringing you closer to your goals felt like a big, warm hug to my soul. Over the last few months, I've had to discover who I am without my story. If I was a guy who created large art installations, viral campaigns, and social movements, what value did I have to offer the world if I couldn't even leave my house? My curiosity led me to start this podcast, but fun as it has been, it's been hard to get people to leave a review on the podcast, let alone imagine what it might look like if I wanted to make a career out of it. Of course, John was ready to remind me about the importance of perspective.
There are people that are so brilliant and so good that keep having opportunities, but most of us, it's harder than that. You apply for a job. Maybe you don't know anyone. Maybe you're just sending in a resume, which you wrote and had trouble formatting. And I think part of it is just imagining how an opportunity that is actually in front of you can help you become the person that you want to be, rather than looking for reasons not to do things. We've had a few things this year that have really made us try to think differently about what is possible. And COVID is very high on that list. We threw out most of our plans and okay, so this doesn't make sense anymore. What does? What is possible now that wasn't before? How has this changed how people think in a way that could actually be positive?
Right, of course. Seeing everything in front of you as an opportunity to learn, grow, and add to your toolkit, always a good reminder. After all, life is a journey, not a destination. And as Steve Jobs famously said, you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. Deciding to stir the pot a little bit, I chose to ask John a provocative question. As an activist and ocean lover, he's had to watch the oceans essentially die over the last 2 decades. And despite his best efforts and all the progress that he's helped to push forward, things were deteriorating faster than ever. I wanted to know, how did it make him feel to know that he was losing the war even though he was winning the battles? How did he stay motivated? Why does he choose to continue fighting?
Depending on how I'm feeling, I answer this question in very different ways. So we usually win. Like most of the things I've worked on, we've ended with some version of winning. The problem is that the wins are too small and they take too long to achieve. And so knowing that that's where we have been for a really long time is probably where we're always going to be. The challenge is to make sure that those inadequate wins are helping us build something. They're helping us build a movement. They're building a power. They're not just incremental in a way that could cement the status quo. They have to be building power in a way that makes sure that the next wins can be bigger and the next wins won't take so long. One of the mistakes I think that we make as activists is in looking back and saying the world is worse, so everything that we've done was a failure and we need to work differently. That's an important question to ask, and I think it's partly correct, but it's also always going to be true. Like we will never have accomplished everything that we need to. And so everything that we'll have done, you can always say is a failure. I think that can take you in the wrong direction too. So for me, I take a lot of inspiration and hope from the really big things that we've all accomplished together in the past. Like we've done some spectacular things that felt impossible and daunting at the time. We can keep doing that. We will keep doing that. We have to keep doing it. Just being real about it, there are things that are being lost and will be lost no matter what we do. And that is hard, having to be honest with people about where we are and where we're headed without crushing their souls to the point where they don't want to bother working with you. That's one of the big challenges of our time, unfortunately. On a personal level, sometimes on a really dark day, one of the things that can help me feel like it's enough is just the accountability part, the revenge part. It's not like the oceans are dying, they're being killed. And so there are people that are doing that. There are companies and governments that are doing that.
Listening to John sharing his perspective was humbling. You can hear in the way that he talks, the words that he uses, and the aspirations that he has, that all the things he wants have nothing to do with ego. Every win is simply a stepping stone to build more momentum, so that the movement itself can gain more power, more legitimacy, and have a greater chance of success. For John, it's never about the I, but always about the we. In stark contrast, the world we live in today is built on social proof and virtue signaling. A lot of people complaining about the injustice that exists in the world, yet unwilling to risk their privilege in a substantial way to bring about the changes they want to see in the world. I know, because sometimes I'm guilty of it too. I asked John about what he thought about this new form of hobby activism, expecting him to hate it. But much to my surprise, he didn't actually like the terminology very much.
I don't like the term very much. I think it is a little dismissive of the people offering what they have. I also think that just because we have a whole bunch of people doesn't mean that anything's going to change. And that hopefully there is a strategy around it. There's a movement that has some clarity around goals and demands. There's enough depth behind it that there are people who can make use of the show of force or activism or movement. Because if it's only just people doing hobby activism or clicking or just talking to their friends, and it isn't connected to something that has real purpose, then it may not amount to much of anything. But the other part of your question is, can it be enough? No, I don't think right now it can be enough. I think this is a moment where we need to be pushing ourselves a little bit if we have any chance of preventing complete, total disaster. And not someday far off, but like if you're having kids now and you're not thinking seriously about what you can do to be a part of the change that is needed to give them a future, I don't know what you're doing.
Basically, to John, even hobby activism has its place in the world, so long as it's attached to an effective organization that can leverage that momentum to create real, lasting change. Placed into the BLM context, I feel a sense of relief watching public pressure being matched with organizations doing the work rather than marketing companies just trying to push product, and I agreed. By this point, I realized that we hadn't actually talked too much about what campaigns looked like in John's world, and what winning looked like to him. So I asked him to travel back in time to share the story of his first win as a leader of Students for Free Tibet.
So when I was leading Students for Free Tibet, we found out that the World Bank was going to fund a project that would have moved 60,000 ethnic Chinese into Tibet, calling it a resettlement project. This is population transfer. It's one of the components of genocide. For the Chinese government, it fit really well into a longer strategy to basically overwhelm and in some ways eliminate Tibetan culture. This is a project that would have included my tax dollars. Everyone in America was helping pay for this. So morally, it seemed terrible and something that we should try and stop. Like, how often do we have a personal role in the eradication of a culture? And so connecting the movement for Tibetan independence to someone in Iowa or New York or anywhere in the world, because the funding is global, as they often are with what I do, like a terrible thing and a powerful opportunity at the same time. So, of course, the first thing is like, who do we know at the World Bank? Who's involved in this decision? Can we get them to change their mind? Like, let's call them up. Let's send them a letter. Let's ask for a meeting. Who are the experts that we can bring on our side? Who can we bring in from the affected community to help people understand this in a more direct way? And of course, the World Bank is pretty big and can be kind of arrogant and doesn't really pay a lot of attention to organizations with names like Students for Free Tibet. So we didn't get very far with that initial approach, even with some really good allies that were much better at working on World Bank related issues. But they helped us understand the strategy that might be effective. They helped us understand the players and how they work together, how decisions are made in the World Bank, what some of the pressure points might be, how governments participate in the World Bank and those decisions. With our new and limited understanding of how this, giant institution operates, we started building a campaign. We started talking to people who already cared about Tibet, who already had interest in human rights, and going as broad as we could. One of the weirder things that I probably did as a campaigner in my career was creating a postcard that had a Nietzsche quote on the back with like almost no explanations, having tens of thousands of those sent to the World Bank decision makers. It seemed to make sense at the time. At one point, I was one of two people that climbed the face of the World Bank. We hung a banner on their headquarters. We literally had to repaint it the day before we hung the banner because they'd made some minor change. So it went from the World Bank approves genocide to the World Bank funds genocide in Tibet or something like that. We're hanging off the building. We get the call from somebody saying the World Bank president would like to invite you in for lunch. And so, of course, we said no. And of course, who knows what we were thinking. But we said no, but we'll meet with you if we can bring in whoever we want to this meeting, because this isn't just us. And so we brought in people from that area of Tibet that were going to be impacted. We brought in allies from organizations that were much better at speaking to the World Bank in a language that they might understand. We didn't win right away, but we won. This ultimately led to the cancellation of the project. The Prime Minister of China commented on it. It was clear that we'd had, like on our big strategy level, we had made sure that the top level leadership of the Chinese government understood that there is a real cost to the continued occupation, to not just PR, but money and policy. And so that was a good day.
What I loved about this story is that it showed resilience. It reminded me of that quote by Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." John didn't have the knowledge or the network, just a great story and the conviction that he was doing the right thing. Although he didn't know what to do, that didn't stop him from trying, learning from his experiences, finding new allies, and upon his moment of triumph, didn't try to take any glory whatsoever, but rather made sure that the right people were in the room to seize upon the opportunity. His pursuit of simply trying to make a difference was ultimately what made the difference. I wanted to know whether his strategies had changed since joining Greenpeace, so I asked for a second story.
In 2008, we did our first survey of supermarkets in the United States and seafood that they were selling. Is it bottom trawled? Is it overfished? All these questions about what they're selling, what policies they have, the ways they talk about it to their customers, all this stuff. And at the time, there were really only 2 supermarkets that were even thinking about sustainable seafood at all. They all failed in this first report that we did. And it was disappointing even for us. It would have been nice to have one good example to point to. There weren't any. They're all terrible, which meant that most of the seafood that was being bought in the United States was either not sustainable or just was lucky. 6 months later, we had seen enough response from a couple companies that we felt like we needed to put out an update. That first report was a real wake-up call. And so we figured that it would be a tool that would help us put pressure on companies at the bottom. No one wants to be at the bottom of the Greenpeace list on anything. It's not a good place to be. But what we didn't really plan for was how long it would continue to be useful at the top end. Why be number 2 if you can be number 1? Why be number 6 if you can be number 3? And we had people in, positions that were not particularly senior waving this report and getting invited into meetings with CEOs or vice presidents who would then say, find out what it's going to take to move us up this list. And so we did one report and then we did another one 6 months later. Each time we're like, well, maybe this will be the last one we do. But it just kept being useful. It kept driving this continuous progress in a way that I don't think we ever really expected. So we put out our 10th version of the report 10 years later, 2018. I think it was 20 out of 22 had achieved passing marks, and quite a few are all the way up into what Greenpeace calls green, which is, it's not bad. It's pretty, it was a reasonably high bar. And I'm not saying that Greenpeace made all that happen ourselves. We were part of a movement. The culture was shifting around us. But we used the same metrics for 10 years and watched this entire sector shift pretty dramatically. And it involved a bunch of out in the street campaigning, a lot of the usual getting people to sign petitions, make phone calls, an enormous array of tactics. We probably threw 50 different things at these supermarkets over that time, including at one point having William Shatner's voice on a robocall to managers at, I can't remember whether that was Costco or Trader Joe's. We sent the vice president of fruitcake, which we came to feel like was the Greenpeace equivalent of the horse head in the bed, just letting them know that we're really thinking about them. And obviously there's still a long way to go, but it felt pretty good to see how much we could achieve together, as a broader movement in a relatively short period of time at a nationwide scale.
The formula to successful campaigning, it would seem, is a combination of experimenting until you find the right pressure point, empowering those sympathetic with the cause with a variety of different tools, and to not be scared to try a wide variety of things, because you never know which ones will stick. My biggest takeaway from this conversation, though, is that ultimately, it's super important to find the right allies. Getting upset and screaming into the void with no one to back things up with real actions or consequences for those in charge means that all that energy can get wasted. That being said, it's also important to not feel paralyzed by the magnitude of the problems and celebrate the progress that has been made. With that being said, that brings episode 13 of Impact Everywhere to a close. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation, and sorry again for the audio quality. Nothing we could do about it this time. For those of you who might want to follow up with John, you can find him on Greenpeace's website under John Hocevar. Next week, we have Gary Bowles, the chair for the Future of Work of Singularity University, who shares with us his perspectives on how we can best prepare ourselves and our companies for the future despite these uncertain times. If you're enjoying these podcasts, please make sure to leave a rating on Apple Podcasts. It really makes a difference. Other than that, thank you for listening, and see you back here next week because impact is everywhere.